in January 2022, the U.S. House of Representatives passed the American Competes Act. It is supposed to be an industrial policy for semiconductor production and supply chain resiliency. But the bill contains some $500 million for media outlets to produce journalism for overseas audiences that is critical of China. Why would a U.S. domestic manufacturing bill plan for budget on foreign news coverage? What kinds of narratives on China would such strategy entail? To understand more about how Western media depicts China, I'm joined today by Jan Oberg. He's a Danish scholar with extensive experience concerning global affairs. Welcome to the Hub, Jan. Let's start with the America Competes Act. This act is supposed to be about chips and semiconductors. It's about competition with China, the great power rivalry, as was billed by the Washington policymakers and elites. But it does contain clauses on, manufacturing narratives on China. $500 million will be spent in the next few years on, directing the news coverage and news angles on China, depicting negative coverages. For a country that prides itself on the freedom of speech, freedom of media, and freedom of the marketplace, what do you make of this very move?
Well, it's obvious that these two things are not comparable. Either you have free media or you don't. If you have government supported by millions of dollars, of course, that means you are not free to write and do what you want, according to journalistic standards. However, this is nothing new. We have public service media in all Western countries, like the Danish broadcasting company or something like that. It's all state financed by tax people. We have private media in the West, which have to operate within the framework of commercialism, of policing their owners, etc. We have intelligence services who, since the 60s, have worked with influencing media. The Americans have what is called the United States Agency for Global Media, which are totally state-financed, USAGM, as it's called. Then you have think tanks, which are often financed by Pentagon and State Department, and the media would use experts from them to give a negative view of China. And finally, you have, as you mentioned, the legislation part. You simply pass a law, or you try to pass a law that will set off money for negative, if you will, propaganda. There's nothing new in that. All countries have it more or less. The embarrassing thing is that the Western world, as you said, professes to be having free media, and that is not the case anymore.
Professor Oberg, how do you envision the $500 million to be used? After all, if you look at Fox News or New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, again, they pride themselves on being free, right? They can, of course, receive commercial donations and commercial money, but not necessarily from the government. They pride themselves as being separate from the government, the so-called fourth estate. How do you perceive and conceive the money to be used, after all?
I suppose a lot of it will go to bureaucracy, of course. I suppose it'll go to training journalists at courses, disseminating particular views throughout social media, and all that costs a lot of money. We are not only having this problem within the media, we're also having these two words, free and independent, in the research world, which often produces information or data or analyses that are used in the media. I mean, you take a place like the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI. It's basically financed by the Swedish government and NATO governments. And I doubt that a researcher can be free or a research process can be totally free if totally financed by governments. My own little foundation is totally outside those frameworks, because we found out, more than 20 years ago, that there were no strings attached when we got some money, very small sum per year from the Swedish government. So it's what I have called the military-industrial media academic complex. The academic and the media have become more important, more uniform, and used more for political purposes. And that is a great danger, because, as you said, the beauty of the Western thinking about this originally was that the media would be the fourth estate. They would be those who place critical questions to people in power. They don't do that anymore. And people like me who are critical to militarism and that type of stuff are not used anymore in the West.
Yeah, Professor, you mentioned NATO in a recent article. You said you do follow Western media news coverage on a daily basis, and I'm quoting you. As you said, they somehow cover only 15% of humanity, but to know what the NATO, EU decision-maker elites are up to, how they legitimate their policies and what they want us to believe is the truth. As for the 85%, generally, negative attitudes preclude curiosity and fair reporting.
Yes, I mean, the 15 and 85% has to do with the fact that what we call the Western world, if you will, the US, EU, NATO, you might add others, that depends on how you define the Western world or the Occident. They are about 15% of humanity in terms of population. The rest of the world is the 85. And I find an incredible increase in navel-gazing in Western media compared to what I can see. For instance, when I go to CGTN or I go to some others, I see, and that has always been the case, the colonial countries, African media, etc., tells you a lot about what happens in the US. But the US basically never tell you, or the Western world's media basically never tells you anything outside the European Union and the United States. We're grossly uninformed, in my view, and I follow this for more than 40 years, increasingly uninformed about what happens in the rest of the world. And of course, if you have a citizenry or an audience which are relatively uninformed about the non-Western, or if you will, the global East and global South, then it's more easy to install a narrative that they will believe in. Whereas if they were well informed about the 85% outside our own culture, it would be more difficult. So, but I mean, there are lots of ways this is done. In a recent report that we published from the Transnational Foundation, we outlined a number of mainstream media manipulation methods, MMM, and some of them are fake. Some of them are omission, some of them are censorship, some of them are self-censorship, some is framing. You have constructed narratives, you have propaganda and disinformation, you have psychological operations, psyops, to install a particular attitude with people who don't know better. And then you have the cancel culture.
Yeah, you talk about so many tactics where Western journalists and their editors, I suppose, are manufacturing content, or as Chomsky put it, manufacturing consent. What of those tactics, or which ones of those tactics really stand out to you as, incredible and unbelievable?
When I have had the probably rather unique experience compared with most citizens, that I've worked in a number of conflict and war zones from Yugoslavia in the 90s onwards. And I have never been to a place anywhere of these conflicts where what I saw myself were comparable or isomorphic or resembled what the media image of that problem was before I left or when I returned. I've often talked with, for instance, United Nations people, and they might have been 3 years in Bosnia during the Yugoslav dissolution wars. And they would say, when we go home to Sweden and we're on Christmas and we read our newspapers, we ask ourselves, is that the country we've been to the last 3 years? Because there's no resemblance. I think that what I'm trying to say is fake and omission has increased a lot in the Western media. Simply constructed narratives that you want people to believe in. For instance, that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was totally unprovoked. Everybody who studied the last 30 years of European history knows that it was not unprovoked. I'm not defending what Russia did, but what I'm saying is it was not unprovoked. Most people think this is a Russia-Ukraine thing and not a Russia-NATO conflict played out sadly and tragically on Ukraine's territory. You can go to Syria, which was a regime change attempt. In Marrakesh in 2014 or whenever it was, 100 countries under the leadership of the United States deposed the legitimately elected President Bashar al-Assad and installed what they call the National Council instead. Nobody had elected these people. And after that started, with that started all these terrible events in Syria, where I also was. So what I've been able to see is that there's an agenda rather than a will to establish a broad, diverse, fact-based coverage of what is happening in the world. And that is very, very sad.
In May 2022, a Zimbabwean media outlet published a report smearing Chinese companies for allegedly mistreating local employees in Zimbabwe, saying the employee was quote-unquote injured, sent to hospital and fired. But the reality was that the employee was not beaten or fired. So why did this outlet publish this false report? It turns out that for every article published slandering content on China, the journalist can receive a remuneration of $1,000 per article from the U.S. Embassy in Zimbabwe through an agent. Is that conceivable for you?
Well, if you're a superpower on its way down and getting more and more desperate because it's losing games here and there, then maybe it's understandable, but it's unacceptable, of course. And then at least you should stop priding yourself of having free media. Then accept that this is state-run media the same way as the West accusing other countries, such as China, also of having only state-run media. But don't try to fool the world that you have free media. That's my basic point. It may be that the US wants to influence media that way with millions of dollars, but then stop saying this use these untruthful concepts of independence and freedom, both in the research world and in the media world.
And then your research told us that there has been systematic, complex information warfare and opinion warfare against China on this very issue of the BRI, producing and manufacturing negative content related to China's BRI program. Tell us more about that.
The reason we started doing this report was that the associates of the foundation and I myself began to ask ourselves, why is this image of China so uniform? And negative.
Uniformly negative.
Uniform. Uniformly negative, yes. There are very few good stories from China. And we found out, much of it is constructed by think tanks, which allegedly are independent again, but often financed with money from the State Department and Pentagon, more or less, of course. And the other thing is there are some standard stories. I mean, for a period, it's Hong Kong. For a period, it's a genocide in Xinjiang. For a period, it's Tibet. What I found out living in Sweden is that shortly after you've seen a kind of story or theme in American or other Western media, that the journalists in Sweden will begin to cover the same story, the same theme. So Swedish journalists would go from the Swedish broadcasting system, would go to Xinjiang. A couple of months after this whole, why it started because Foreign Minister or Secretary of State Pompeo simply declared the last day in his office that what happened in Xinjiang was a genocide. He never, as far as I know, there's not a single page on State Department that documents this. There are a number of so-called independent foundations which thought that they had substantiated that. We pulled that apart because much of it is not research worthy of a master's exam. But the long story short is that it is a repetition of stories that somebody ought to ask, how do we decide what we cover about China and why don't we do it more independently? I don't think there's any conspiracy here. It's a kind of groupthink that in the media world, you sit down in the morning at the editorial office and say, what are we going to cover today? And it's within a framework. If somebody says, hey, why don't we do something new today? Let's see what is happening in China that is interesting, or how people live, or let's make a report, send people over there and see how the farmers are living, or their life has become better the last 30 years. You don't raise that because you've already been screened or filtered into your job, and somebody with those attitudes would probably not have a job in a Western editorial office. So there's so many mechanisms here, and groupthink is very dangerous. It goes back to an American social psychologist in the 60s who coined the term groupthink. It means that you filter off, you close off information or data that does not fit your worldview. You do that over time. And at some point, you believe that you are all-powerful and you cannot be wrong. And that's when you make a terrible wrong decision. So I think we're on the wrong way in the West. I'm not saying everything is good in China or anything else. But what I am saying is we should not pride ourselves of something we are basically self-destroying at the moment. That's free debate, free media. independent research, etc. And it's very sad. I'm a researcher. I've seen the development over the last 40 years.
Professor Jan Oberg, thank you so much for your insights, your research, and for your time. I look forward to picking your brain again soon, hopefully.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure always.
That was Jan Oberg, and that will do it for this edition of The Hub on CGTN. Thank you all so very much for tuning in. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Our news coverage continues on CGTN. Bye and take care.